Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Ong, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great honor to be a distinguished visitor at RSIS, a very prestigious Institute of International Studies. Usually, in the late afternoon, sometimes I get a little bit sleepy. So over the next 1 hour, if I say something very strange, don't worry, that's just my kind of a dream talk. The topic today, the U.S.-China relations, they always hit the headlines. Today, even more so, given what President Trump has been doing recently with regards to trade imbalance with China. Now, what I'm going to do today is not exactly comment on the current event in U.S.-China relations, but rather I want to provide a big picture of this relationship and give you my opinion about the prospects of this relationship. Let me start with some assumptions as the background of my talk on this relationship. First and foremost, over the last quarter century, since the end of Cold War, U.S.-China relations have been mainly featured by the U.S. responding to the rise of China. You may know, with the end of Cold War, a central theme for U.S. foreign policy has been to expand the U.S. influence to the rest of the world, try to build the unipolar world order, right? That has been the tenet of U.S. Foreign policy for decades. However, for their relations with China, how to deal with a rising China basically has been the thread underlining the U.S.-China policy. In 1992, when the Cold War ended, China's GDP was about somewhere between 6 or 7% of the U.S. So that was 1992. And today, last year, China's GDP was somewhere between 60% and 70% of the U.S. by exchange rate. By power purchasing parity, China already surpassed U.S. in 2014. So you can see this kind of shifting power balance, economic power balance between China and U.S. In the last quarter of century. The second assumption is generally this relationship has been featured by both competition and cooperation. Sometimes we say cooperation and competition, depending on where you come from, and also depending on specific issue areas. And however, it seems in recent years that competitive side has become more preeminent in this relationship, even though cooperation also expanded remarkably over the last 2 decades. So the challenge is how to keep a good balance between these 2 dimensions. The next assumption is that when we think about the prospect of Sino-US relations, one need to look at the whole picture of this relationship. It's not just military dimension, security dimension, not just economic dimension, but rather the entire picture. And interactions between China and U.S. at bilateral level, regional level, and global level. And also, one need to look beyond the Trump administration because the Trump administration, in my opinion, is entire worldview is very narrow, imbalanced, and to some extent outdated. So it doesn't necessarily represent the long-term trend within the U.S. policy community in dealing with China. So what's happening under Trump administration is important for U.S.-China relations, but we should look beyond it. Finally, we should also keep in mind that China has growing capability in shaping China-US interactions, and Beijing is playing an increasing role in this relationship, not only in material terms, but also in normative terms, as well as in tactical and strategic terms. President Xi, as compared with his predecessor, I think has become more dynamic and proactive in shaping relations with the United States. And also, as I just mentioned, the narrowing power gap between the U.S. and China. So even though in many cases, U.S. still appears to be on the initiative, but China is also become more proactive in this process, making these relations a really two-way street, not just one-way street. With the four general assumptions, next I want to go to some specific areas to say where China and U.S. cooperate, where they compete, and how they make the big picture for this relationship. Now let's start with, maybe I should have, I want to, is this on? Yes, come. Thank you. Now let's, for the competition, the breakout is economic, political, and military, and at the bilateral level, regional level, and global level. Now let's go quickly to say how they play out here. Economic competition at the bilateral level, for the U.S., one concern is China overtaking the U.S. in overall economic power. The general mainstream prediction is that this may happen in the next 10 years. Okay, and also what concerns President Trump at the moment mostly is about trade imbalance, and according to him, it's over 300 billion US dollars last year, and also technology transfer, what they call the forced technology transfer from U.S. companies to Chinese companies. So that's at the bilateral level. At the regional level, the U.S. is concerned about China becoming the regional center of gravity, because today most of the regional members, they are trading more with China than with the United States, which was not the case 10 or 15 years ago. So that is a big shift. And also, the U.S. is concerned that China may become a driver of regional economic cooperation. Regional economic cooperation started from 1990s when the U.S. pushed for APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Later on, when the U.S. lost interest in APEC, ASEAN began to push for East Asian cooperation. So we had the 10+3 cooperation process, which the U.S. was not a part of it. And then during the Obama administration, they launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, which was almost concluded, but just abandoned by Trump after he came into office. So the U.S. concern was that gradually China will become a major driver after U.S., after ASEAN, in promoting regional economic cooperation, which means China is going to help shape the rules and norms for regional economic cooperation. At the global level, what concerns the U.S. is China's growing clout associated with Belt and Road Initiative, as just highlighted by Ambassador Ong, and also China creating new institutions, norms, and rules like AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS country development bank, and maybe more multilateral development banks in the future. So this is what the U.S. feel the competition plays out between two countries on the economic dimension at different levels. looks at political, second category, political level. Bilaterally, the U.S. is concerned about China's advantage in its political system and development model. Usually, the U.S. has a very strong self-confidence about its political system and development model, which they call the Washington Consensus. However, after the 2008 financial crisis, after Trump becoming the U.S. president, many people, especially the elite, began to worry about the institutions in the U.S. So in their opinion, the U.S. system is a good system, but it doesn't work well. China's system is a bad system, but it works quite well. So this puzzles them. And very recently, for example, the American government officials, including the CIA director, began to talk about China's political influence in the U.S., right? China's political penetration. It used to be the other way. In China, we worry about the U.S. peaceful evolution strategy, the U.S. political influence, right? That has been there for many decades. So that is a very interesting development. And also the U.S. is concerned that China's development model may become more and more attractive to the developing countries. Many of the developing countries, they started by embracing the Western model, but several decades later, it just didn't work out. Now, some of them turn to the Chinese model to see whether it works better. For China, I don't think we have an interest in exporting this kind of model, because we think every country has its unique circumstances. So you cannot just copy the model from another country. So, but in the U.S., people believe that maybe China's development model may become more attractive to some developing countries. In the regional level, the concern is that China may draw closer more regional countries, particularly the U.S. allies, and undermine U.S. maritime superiority in the Western Pacific. Because today, almost all the major U.S. allies, China is their #1 trading partner, not the U.S., I guess including Japan. So according to the logic, political influence follows economic influence. So the concern is that this will somehow loosen up the ties between Washington and its regional allies. And they are watching carefully about the tension in relations between some of the U.S. allies and Washington, and to see whether China played a role in this regard. Globally, certainly, U.S. is upset with China-Russia cooperation with the UN Security Council, because China, Russia, as two permanent members of UN Security Council, we blockade from time to time the proposals made by the U.S. or British on certain issues. And gradually, the U.S. has become more concerned about China's growing influence in Africa and Latin America. What's interesting was in the last several months, when the former, not only the former Secretary of State, or he's still there, Tillerson, when he started a trip to Africa, he gave a major speech at Washington calling Africans, you have to be cautious about China. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And recently, when he visited Latin America, he repeated the same thing. So it's quite rare when the U.S. Secretary of State going to visit another region, the signal is about how the U.S. is going to promote closer ties with those countries. But to caution those countries, you have to be careful about China. The signal is that, A, they have seen a rapid growth of Chinese influence, even just economic influence in those regions. And two, they are not confident that the U.S. can devote more resources in developing economic cooperation with those countries and regions. Now, the third category of competition is military. At the bilateral level, certainly the U.S. is concerned about China's growing military capability. On the one hand, the U.S. acknowledges there is still a big gap between China and U.S. in terms of military capability. On the other, they think China is catching up very quickly, especially in the new area, the emerging areas like outer space, cyber, artificial intelligence. So in conventional terms, U.S. leads far ahead of China, but in the new areas, the gap is quite narrow. And in the regional level, of course, what concerns the U.S. is China's challenge to U.S. military superiority in the Western Pacific. Let me put it this way. After World War II, the U.S. Navy has enjoyed absolute freedom in the Pacific. They can feel 100% confident about getting involved militarily in every corner of the Pacific. But today, this is changing. Because of China's growing military capability, the U.S. is not feeling so comfortable about its dominance in the Western Pacific, especially within the so-called Fourth Island chain. Because China's missile, submarine, and surface ship development. And this is going to be more and more the case in the future. So even though the U.S. still dominate the Pacific overall, but is losing its edge in the Western Pacific. At the global level, what's interesting is that in the last 2 years, the U.S. began to watch China's growing military presence in the Indian Ocean. They watch carefully about what China is going to do with other countries in the Indian Ocean. Either China will seek the access to their bases, or China is trying to create new military bases overseas in the Indian Ocean. So that is basically a sketch of the competition between China and U.S. In different categories at various levels. Now, let's move to the next category, that is cooperation. Bilaterally, certainly economic cooperation is still the anchor of this relationship because now China is America's largest trading partner and the third largest export market. In the last 10 years, the U.S. export to China has been growing at an average of 11% per year. Okay, that has been the rate. While the Chinese export to the U.S. has been growing only at half of that rate, around 6%. So, and also the U.S. The growth of U.S. export to the Chinese market is faster than its export to any other market in the world. That means China is becoming more and more important to U.S. as an export market, given China's expanding domestic consumption. Next, of course, is investment. And it used to be a one-way street, U.S. investment to China, until after the financial crisis. So Chinese investment, direct investment to the U.S. started late, but rose very quickly. Today, it's already accumulated somewhere between 60 billion to 70 billion US dollars, while the U.S. accumulated investment in China over the last several decades is only around 75 billion US dollars. So the gap is narrowing down very quickly. And finally, financially, we all know China holds more than 1 trillion U.S. federal bonds, the largest overseas holder, nation-state holder of U.S. treasuries. So this creates unprecedented economic interdependence between two countries, and this will only get deeper and deeper. Also, at the social cultural level, if you look at the people-to-people exchanges, last year we had about 4 million Chinese tourists going to the US, while 350,000 Chinese students going to study in the US. And the US last year had about 2 million tourists coming to China and around 20,000 US students coming to study in China. So if you look at the people-to-people exchanges, they are also growing very quickly. So this serves as a very strong bond anchoring this relationship. At the region level, we do have a lot of areas of cooperation. One, of course, is the Korean Peninsula. Especially in the last 2 years, China-US has conducted unprecedented cooperation in imposing sanctions on North Korea for its nuclear and missile program. And you all read about the news these days, how China-US are interacting. When President Trump decided to have a summit meeting with Kim Jong-un of DPRK, he picked up phone and called President Xi to brief President Xi. And also, likewise, for President Xi, after visiting North Korean leader left China, he sent a letter to President Trump briefing him about the visit. So very close coordination and consultation on the Korean Peninsula. In Afghanistan, actually, we have had very quiet but close cooperation, including jointly training the diplomats, 1 week in Beijing, another week in Washington. So that's what we have been doing. And also, we are helping training the police and military person, providing ammunition to the government troops, and China-US, along with several other countries, have been trying to promote the reconciliation process within the Afghanistan, even though China declined the US proposal that, after US and NATO reduced their military presence, Washington suggested China should send troops to Afghanistan. China said no, thank you. And as regional economic cooperation, certainly Asia-Pacific economic cooperation, and even in the long term, we agreed in principle the long-term goal for this region is to create the FTA in the Asia-Pacific. Of course, this will not happen during the Trump administration, but I think sooner or later the entire Asia-Pacific should be integrated into some kind of region-wide FTA arrangement. And last but not least, of course, is dealing with the non-traditional security challenges. For example, on fighting terrorism, China-US has very close cooperation on, for example, intelligence sharing, and also cutting off the funding source for terrorist organizations, etc. So these the areas, some of the areas for cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. Global level, first and foremost, UN Security Council. They are both competition and cooperation. And North Korea is one example. Usually when the UN Security Council is going to pass a resolution, sometimes the resolution was drafted by China, sometimes drafted by the US. If it was drafted by China, then it will be revised by the US. If drafted by the US, then it will be revised by China. World Bank, IMF, in these two major financial institutions, China is a major contributor, financial contributor. And now, according to the latest round of reform, China has become number 3 in terms of voting rights, quota, etc. So hopefully, the forthcoming new round of reform will lift China to number 2, increasing China's stakes in these established financial institutions. So, and which also will create more rationale for China-US cooperation. One thing worries the U.S. after China successfully launched the ARIB was that whether China will 另起炉灶, that means China will start a new institution. So it will stay away, gradually walk away from these established institutions. China's answer was very clear that we would continue to support and will work with the established institutions, while we also believe that some new multilateral institutions should be created to complement the current institutions. WTO, in the short term, we are quite pessimistic about WTO, but in the long term, I think both China and the United States want to work with World Trading Entity, and the next round of negotiation, I don't know when it will be launched, should be very important in upgrading the standards currently at the WTO organization. And finally, of course, global governance. Again, let's look beyond the Trump administration. Trump administration doesn't believe in global governance, doesn't believe in climate change, etc. Right? So the only thing Trump cares about is about fighting terrorism. Right? Other than that, he doesn't have much interest with global governance. But I just believe that this issue will become all the more important. If the international relations in the 21st century will be fundamentally different from the past century and before, that will be mainly because global governance will become a major factor shaping the international relations. While in the past, it was basically the national interests, individual country. They only think about the national interests. Today, when it comes to global governance, you have to think about the community and cooperation. So this is the quick tour of the areas of both competition and cooperation between China, U.S. in various areas. Now, some observations following that. First is the power gap between China and U.S. will further narrow down, but China will remain in an inferior position relative to the U.S. It is easy to project that maybe in the next 10 years, economically, China will surpass the U.S. But you have to measure national capability in a comprehensive way. Economic capability is only one indicator, even though it may be the most important one. But you have to think about the military, you have to think about technology, you have to think about your soft power, right? So in those regards, I think China will remain behind the U.S. in the foreseeable future. For example, militarily, China is not going to invest so heavily in building thousands of nuclear warheads as the U.S. did in the Cold War. I mean, it's nonsense, unnecessary, it's a waste of money. And China is not going to build 12 aircraft carrier battle groups. It's not. China is not going to, build military bases all over the world and station hundreds of thousands of soldiers abroad. It's unlikely. So militarily, I think China will continue to be lagging behind the U.S., even though it will have the reliable deterrence capability vis-a-vis the U.S. in the Western Pacific. That's for sure. Second argument is that economic interdependence between two countries will go deeper and more symmetric. More symmetric means that in the past, Americans always say China needs the U.S. more than the U.S. does on China. However, this is changing. I mean, given what I just explained to you, increasing the U.S. export to China and also the growing Chinese investment in the U.S., with China becoming more significant to the U.S., that's true economically. If you look at the trend in China's export, actually the U.S. market is becoming less important to China than before. Because on the one hand, Now we are relying more and more on the domestic market. On the other hand, our export destination has become more diversified. In the early middle 1990s, the U.S. alone accounted for 25–30% of China's overall export. That's huge. Today is only a half of it, maybe a little bit over 15%. This will go further down. But China, as I said, will become more significant to the U.S. in terms of trade, investment, and financial sector. Third, as China rises, Sino-US relations will evolve around the logic of power sharing, not power transition. As I just alluded, even if China surpasses the U.S. economically, China will still lag behind the U.S. in terms of comprehensive national capability. So what's going to happen between China and U.S. in the 21st century is not like something happened between U.S. and Britain after World War II. After World War II, the U.S. just replaced Britain in almost every major dimension and become the new master on world stage. Well, what's going to happen between China and U.S. is not like this. China will continue have to work with U.S., which while the U.S. will still have a relatively more advantageous position vis-a-vis China. So for China, it's not something power shift, but or power transition, but power sharing. How we can bargain with the United States for more power and influence, just like the reform of World Bank or IMF, giving China more voting rights, more quotas, etc. While the U.S. should learn to share power with China. When China's capability grows and also China is willing to shoulder more responsibility. And the example here, not a good example, is really the U.S. reaction to ARIB, which was a bad example, showing that the U.S. was not ready to share power with the rising economies like China. Strategically, while China needs to exercise strategic self-restraint, the U.S. will need to adjust to a changing reality. China rises quickly and has become diplomatically more proactive over the last several years. So that creates a concern on the part of the U.S. and others that China may become more assertive, and even more aggressive. So the question for the risk for the rising powers is always how you behave in a measured way. Don't be too eager and too impatient, and push for your interests in a reasonable way. So I think that's what history teaches China. Actually, the U.S. didn't come to the world stage until after World War II broke out. So major powers, in most cases, they rose and become the new player on the world stage largely because of event-driven, crisis-driven, not because you have a grand strategy and then you can get there. It's not the case. So you need to wait for the right moment. For the Chinese leaders, before 2008 financial and economic crisis, I think they didn't have much thought about China playing a major role on the international stage. It was only after the financial crisis when the entire world looked at China. Now you have to play a role and help deal with the situation. Then they began to think seriously about what we can do and what we should do. So I think this is still a learning process. The U.S. need to adjust to a changing reality. I mean, this is no longer a unipolar world. Even though if you go to Washington, many people, people in the loop, they still have a very Washington-centered view about, maintaining the U.S. supremacy in a global context. Actually, this is no longer the case. That is no longer the case. Just look at the U.S. share of global GDP, how it has declined over the last decade, and also look at the U.S. Influence on the world stage. So I think the U.S. Sometimes they are very quick in catching the changing reality. Sometimes they are very slow, and sometimes they are very much caught in the internal fight about how to define the changing reality. Last but not the least, I think is the need and significance of Sino-US coordination and cooperation in global governance will only grow in the future. So, as I said again, let's look beyond the Trump administration. The next administration, either Republican or Democrat, I think will take a more positive attitude about global governance. During the Obama administration, even though the rebalanced Asia strategy really prompted the geopolitical competition between China and U.S. in the Asia Pacific, but at the same time, Obama did have a world view about China-U.S. cooperation in global governance, and the significance attached to that did play a major role in shaping his overall China policy. So I think, even though at the moment Trump just feels not interested in this topic, actually when he met Chinese President Xi, and when President Xi brought up the topic of global governance issues, he just shows no interest at all, no response, no a single word as a comment on this, says that he is not either not interested nor prepared, or both. So let's be patient. Okay, finally, what are the implications for this region economically, politically, and security front? The time to have 10 minutes? Okay. So economically, this is a good news. A serious Sino-US trade war or economic war is highly unlikely, right? So if you want to bet on the market, so trust me, and this will not happen, because basically I believe that what Trump has been doing over the last 1 week is a kind of a bargaining tactic, and which should not surprise people who are familiar with his so-called art of the deal. I understand currently the negotiation is going on between Beijing and Washington over the trade issue. So this is a good news for the entire region. Second, Asia Pacific will not be divided and separated economically. China and U.S. would continue to coexist and cooperate in some regional economic mechanisms. Now, during the Obama administration, the U.S. pushed for TPP without China, while East Asian countries pushed for RCEP without the U.S. So there was a concern that in the future this region will be divided into two competing economic blocs. I don't think that's going to be the case, because we have the overlapping membership in both mechanisms, and even for China, U.S. On the one hand, we both belong to the APEC, Economic Cooperation Mechanism. And also, more importantly, between China and U.S. bilaterally, we are negotiating the China-U.S. Treaty of Investment. And some people even go further in suggesting that in the future there should be the framework of trade and investment between China and the United States. So I don't think this region will be divided into two separate competing economic blocs, simply because the economies of China and the U.S. have been intertwined. Even though we have our respective favorite regional economic mechanisms. Third, with the sustainable growth in Chinese economy, which I'm quite confident, 5%, 6% in the next 10 years, the economic center of gravity will further shift to the Western Pacific. So if you look at the overall structure of the regional economy, in the last 10 years, there has been a fundamental shift in the center of gravity from North America to the Western Pacific, largely because of the rise of Chinese economy. So in the past, when we talk about Asia Pacific, especially in 1990s, it's more Pacific than Asia. It's North America centered, US centered. But today, if you look at the picture, I think it's gradually becoming more Asia than Pacific. That is a change in economic landscape. Politically, Washington will adjust reluctantly and slowly to the changing power balance in the region and learn to share influence with Beijing. Now, everyone in the USA, Obama administration made a mistake on the issue of AIIB. They think the US should join AIIB. So maybe Trump will make a decision on that. The only concern is that Congress may not approve because it doesn't have money to contribute to AIIB. So the US is not interested in funding the infrastructure development of other countries, while their own infrastructure is becoming a kind of like a third world country infrastructure. So that's a big problem. If you do not ask US to donate money, they will say right away yes. So they would like to join. Most countries in the region would prefer developing relations with both Beijing and Washington. That is so self-confident, so no need to elaborate on that. On the security side, Beijing and Washington will continue to coordinate and cooperate on important regional issues, right? North Korea, Afghanistan, and other issues in the region. China's security influence in the Western Pacific will go up, while the US security influence will relatively decline, leading to a new strategic equilibrium. What does this mean? This means in the next 1 or 2 decades, the US will remain dominant in the entire Pacific, but they will make adjustments to changing power relationship in the Western Pacific. Actually, this is already happening. If you look, the U.S. relocating its presence from Korean Peninsula to Guam, this kind of adjustments, leading the fourth island chain to Japan, that shows that the U.S. on the military side is prepared for a different security landscape in this region, so that there will be a new strategic equilibrium in the Western Pacific. Security tensions and frictions between China and the U.S. are inevitable, but unlikely escalating into major military conflict. This tension and frictions are from Korean Peninsula to East China Sea, South China Sea. They come from time to time, but rational voice will say it's unlikely the two countries will fight over them, simply because if they do, they will suffer too much. They will suffer too much. So I think, even if for President Trump, he understands, for example, he understands the consequences of a war on the Korean Peninsula. That's only with North Korea, not to say, a war with China. I mean, the American military figures, political figures, from time to time talk about a possible war with China. Usually it's for budgetary reasons, we understand. And usually occurs in the spring when the Congress is going to approve the budget for the next year. After that, you wouldn't hear much voice on that. So that's part of the U.S. political phenomenon. As the U.S. expands its network of security alliance and partnership, that has been done by the Obama administration over the last several years. Alliance plus partnership, including some countries in ASEAN. China also helps develop other security cooperation mechanisms. Some regional members may join both. For example, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? Launched by China and Russia and 4 Central Asian republics, now joined by both India and Pakistan. And on the Korean Peninsula, maybe the current round of reconciliation will lead to some sub-regional security mechanism in the future, which will include 2 Koreas, US, China, Japan, Russia, and maybe others. So that will be something replacing the current truce treaty signed after the Korean War. And there can be other security mechanisms in Southeast Asia. For example, over the South China Sea issue, there can be a new regional, sub-regional security arrangement involving related countries. So even on the security front, China and US do have the overlapping areas in which they interact with each other. I still have a lot to say, but I'm very conscious of time. So why don't I just stop here and leave the time for questions and answers? Okay, thank you.